are Classical 90.5 WSMC Southern's radio station. We're located right behind Brock Hall. We're a classical music station. One of our goals is to bring music sort of into everyday context. So how does music relate to issues that are going on in the world or just in your lives in general? So this is the first of what's going to be many events over the next few months, semesters, years that are going to be sort of relating music to just your lives. And if you've never listened to the station before, you can either tune in 90.5 in your car, wherever you tune in the radio, or download our app. It's WSMC, Classical 90.5.
Or WSMC Public Radio app.
Or WSMC Public Radio app. What I want to do to start this convocation tonight is make refugees relevant to right here and right now. So I have invited the owner of a business downtown. Michael is the owner of Mad Priest Coffee, and I'm just going to turn it over to you and let everyone know what you guys are doing.
Yeah, my name is Michael Rice, founder and owner of Mad Priest Coffee and Mad Priest Events, and we have nothing to do with music. But the reason I'm here is because we're kind of partnered with Opera Tennessee for their upcoming show, because we basically formed out of the idea that we want to take our trade and our skill, i.e. coffee, and then make something of that to empower and employ refugees. So when my wife and I were living abroad opening coffee shops, our most regular everyday customers were Syrian and Iraqi refugees. And when we came back to the States, we were basically kind of awestruck with this problem that was growing increasingly, especially within the media, even portraying it, of refugees, displaced peoples, but a lot of them not having an opportunity, not having hope, and coming to the States and having the right to work, but then not really knowing where to go from that. A lot of them having production jobs that just weren't that great. You know, I've met people with chemical engineering degrees who can't get anything better than an Amazon job. And even if that pay is halfway decent, there wasn't like this hope of, I want to do something with my life, I want to be a normal person, and kind of having that refugee label status on them for the rest of their lives. And so we basically formed as a normal for-profit business, but said, really, let's hire refugees. And it's even branched out from there. So we started an event company as well that, like in May, we have an evening in Iraq where we're basically showcasing and giving a platform to an Iraqi family who want to start a catering business. And you know, this is an opportunity for them to showcase their food to hundreds of people and then potentially move on from there. And so, you know, we're just doing our thing. We're doing coffee, we're doing events, but at the same time trying our best to give opportunity to local refugees. And I think my commission to y'all tonight, like as you hear this and as you kind of explore that more in terms of like what that looks like in the local, I don't know, I guess the local aspect of Chattanooga is like there's a community and they're kind of hidden, but like they're there and they need help. And you know, people like Bridge Refugee Services need volunteers. But even beyond that, to like know that you can be a normal business and like actually do something about problems. You can find solutions to them. And our goal is to say we're not going to be some just normal nonprofit and get outside funding, because how else would we really empower refugees to like start their own business or to go on and do something if they're just seeing us get grants and stuff like that. So seeing the everyday struggles of a small business and questioning how much money we're going to make, like they see that and they say, well, hey, I can do that too. You know, like I can start from scratch and get a small micro grant, micro loan, and actually start what I want to do. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And we'll be at the Opera in May, just serving coffee, drinks, and hanging out. I'm sure my staff will probably be there as well. So definitely, if you're in the city, come by and see us. We're on Broad Street and South Side. And yeah, we're all over the city, so kind of catch us as you can. Come by and say hi. So appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Michael. So tonight's panel discussion is called The Consul, and it's actually in partnership with Opera Tennessee. Their upcoming production is of an opera by Giancarlo Menotti, The Consul, which is about a refugee family in World War II era Europe. We don't really know the country. So we're bringing everything tonight's discussion into the context of this opera. So right now I'm just going to introduce our panel members. We have Sara, Snider, Schone. Sara, what is your capacity with Opera Tennessee?
I am the founder and artistic director, so it basically means I do all of the work and sleep the least for the company. So I'm the one that chooses the operas and hires the singers, oftentimes sews the costumes and builds the sets as well. We're a little grassroots opera company.
And then we have Professor Shannon Martin, and you are a professor where?
History and Political Studies, obviously the best department on campus.
And Dr. Linda Tim, and you are?
I teach in the English department here on campus, just down the hall from Shannon.
All right, so we're going to start with a question for Professor Martin, and it's actually just to define what is a refugee. We hear the word refugee used a lot, and then we also hear other words like displaced peoples, nomads, migrants, stateless peoples. What is a refugee, and how is it different than all those other things?
That's a great question. We hear those words tossed around a lot in the news, and sometimes we get a little confused, right? With refugees, we're really talking about people that have crossed national borders, right? That's really fundamental to the idea of a refugee. And they have to have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race or religion, nationality. They have to have a reason for why they can't return to their own country, right? But they have to have crossed those borders. If they haven't crossed those borders, then they might be what we consider IDPs, or internally displaced persons. And those people might have the same kinds of threats against them. They might be persecuted for the same sorts of reasons. They might have loss of homes. They might be displaced to another section of the country. They might have given up jobs, houses, all of these things that are necessary for survival, but they haven't crossed national boundaries, and that kind of makes it a little bit tricky for intervention from international organizations or governments, right? And then we might think of economic migrants, right? So that kind of enters into the equation when we're thinking about why people are leaving their countries, and this whole refugee crisis, right? We talk about this refugee crisis and migrant crisis when we think of people going to Europe and this mass influx of people that are migrating on the move, right? Some of those people are also on the move because of economic opportunity, but it's important to kind of separate these groups and realize why they're on the move. And those that are on the move for economic opportunities, those that are on the move because they're persecuted, those that are on the move because of violence, those that are on the move or just stateless, meaning that they're stateless persons, that they have no nationality, meaning that they lack the very fundamental protections that we are privileged to have through our passport. We take that for granted sometimes, but in fact that being stateless, we have about 12 million stateless people around the world, so it's actually quite a large population.
Okay, so now that we have this sort of picture of what a refugee is, that sort of context, I want to ask a question to Sara about the opera specifically. So the opera is about refugees, but can you just tell us the plot and in what context we encounter these refugees?
Sure, so you meet a lot of refugees in this opera. There is one main family, and they are fleeing persecution. It's all sort of nebulous. It is an unknown place in Europe. It's about World War II era, but the directions actually say, when you're staging it, don't put a place on it. But this is a country that is poor. All of the characters seem very poor, and most of them are trying to get out to just anywhere. So there are some characters who are fleeing because, well, the main character, her husband's on the run from the secret police, and his parting words as he leaves to jump a boundary illegally is go to the consulate, get a visa, and come join me. So that's the main family. You also then meet all of these characters in the consulate every day. Some are stateless, so they don't have the proper paperwork to go anywhere. There's a woman who's just gotten out of a concentration camp. She cannot go home, but she has nothing and she has no paperwork. Where is she gonna go? And she goes to every consulate in town every day, and no one will help her. So you meet a variety of people, and it really does deal with different types of displaced persons and different stories, which I think is an interesting choice for the composer. He really gave all of them their own story.
So speaking of storytelling, our next question is for Dr. Tim. How are the stories of refugees told? I mean, obviously we encounter refugees all throughout history, and here is a fine example of refugees being told in storytelling. But what about in a contemporary sense? What sort of rhetoric is being used now to talk about refugees during our modern refugee crisis?
Yeah, I think it's a really great opportunity for us to kind of do a comparison between stories of history, right? Many displaced persons that that came out of World War II, people kind of moving globally, and then kind of the current context where we have, I believe it's more than 20 million displaced persons around the world. And so just wondering, how do we speak of these individuals? And I would like to say that it's always in positive terms, right? That we welcome them into our homes, or we welcome them into the spaces where we live. But I think the rhetoric tends to be quite divided. It depends on the perspective of the people who are speaking about these stories. So on the one hand, you may have individuals who speak very positively, speak in terms of hope, speak in terms of the humanity of individuals, so talking about their family situation, perhaps how they're trying to work really hard, the idea of empowerment, kind of getting them resettled in certain communities, things like that, versus perhaps more contentious rhetoric that sets up this boundary between us as civilized people who have very secure homelands and very secure spaces of living, versus individuals who are displaced because there's something somehow inherently wrong with, or fundamentally wrong with, their character. And so I think they often are, in a sense, demonized in some stories, or seen as perhaps dangerous because they are coming in and perhaps this idea of infiltrating our borders or things like that. So I think it depends on which stories you look at, but it is always really interesting to look at the type of word choices that are used when we speak about the stories of other individuals.
So let's go a little bit more in depth. And you were talking about the number of worldwide refugees. Let's ask Professor Martin, where are these refugees coming from? What is the number? Where are they going?
These are good questions. And I think kind of going back to why are these numbers important? The numbers are important because otherwise we just have these fears, right? And putting numbers and faces to these questions are going to kind of dispel these fears, right? So when we think about the actual numbers of displaced people, we're thinking about 65.3 million people that are forcibly displaced. 65.3 million. When we think about refugees, we're thinking about 21.3 million people. 21.3 million is larger than New York City, just to put it in context. When we're thinking about where they're being hosted, you're probably thinking, oh, the U.S. has all of these people, right? Because we're just so welcoming, and we're always hearing about how all of them are coming to the U.S. But in reality, it's oftentimes the countries that are most are closest to where these conflicts are taking place that have the least amount of resources available, right? And so when we think about them having the least amount of resources available, on top of already dealing with tumultuous or difficult scenarios, whether it be governments that are struggling already or populations that are already kind of facing difficult times, we think of the Middle East that has 39% of these populations. We think of Africa that has 29%. We think of Asia and the Pacific hosting 14%. In reality, the Americas only host 12%. So these are important statistics to be able to kind of wrap your brain around and to be able to understand what is our role, what do we want our role to be, is this the percentage that we want to carry forward? If it is, great. If it's not, what do we do about it? And kind of question this and move forward.
So there is a part of this whole refugee crisis, and that is bureaucracy. And we've sort of touched on that a little bit. We've hinted at it, but it's actually one of the main themes in the opera. So Sara, how does bureaucracy play a role in this opera?
I think that's probably the most impressive takeaway when you watch this opera. You have all these characters, and they're lovely, and your heart bleeds a little bit for them. And then they go to the consulate, and the other end of that spectrum is the secretary, which is my role. And I sit at a typewriter, and I type, and I do not make eye contact with these people. And every day they come up, and I say, next. It's all very mechanical, and their paperwork's just not right. Every single day. It's not been notarized on the right line, the photography is the wrong size. Whatever it is, I never give a visa away to these poor people. They're in there every day trying to talk to the consul, and all of them say over and over again, just let me talk to him. I mean, he's the big head honcho that sits behind my desk, and you never see him, but he's sort of this Oz figure, and they're all convinced if they could just get in and tell their story of course he would help them. And no one ever gets that far because there's just a stack of paperwork and they never get past the paperwork point.
So we were talking about just passports and nationalities before we touched on that. Dr. Tim, what is the importance in today's modern society of a passport? What role do borders play in all of this, in sort of just a broad context?
I think it's a great question because I think, and I'm sure Professor Martin can speak more to this, but our conception of national identity across the globe is still very much rooted in the nationalistic paradigm set up in the 19th century, I think, set up by the empires, particularly European empires, where they went out and conquered the global space and saw it as conquering these other territories as ways to further advance their own project back home, right? And so with the dismantling of these empires, especially post-World War II, it's meant that there's different strata in terms of priorities or hierarchy, you could say, of national spaces. And so national spaces in the developed world, as we like to label it, spaces like America or Canada or the UK, definitely parts of Western Europe, they score very high in terms of desirable passports. For example, many of you who may have traveled abroad on your American passports probably don't often have to apply for a visa before you travel. For example, you may be able to travel in Europe for up to 6 months without declaring residency or applying for special compensation or anything like that. Whereas other individuals, you could say further down the totem pole, perhaps, their passports are not valued. And in fact, they're almost, you could say, valueless almost, in that these individuals, wherever they travel outside their own national borders, have to apply for some sort of visa. And to apply for that visa requires financial backing. And so the idea of passports kind of dictating where the value of a human, the value of a person, I think is really interesting, especially in the post-global kind of economic situation where we live in, where the work of society is often done far outside the national borders, where a product is sold. So it's very complicated. But yeah.
So we're touching on this concept of some nations having a sort of freedom of movement to be able to go wherever they want, sort of whenever they want, within reason. Professor Martin, so refugees face a whole other sort of system. They can't just hop on a plane and go where they want to go. It's a very complicated system. Can you sort of describe the process of what it takes to even just be considered for relocation?
Right. No. That's a really good question. And when you think about it, say in the context of the U.S., what it takes for refugees to be able to come here to the U.S., you're at least looking at somewhere between 18 to 24 months. And that's if you have all of your records back home and you come from a fairly peaceful location. I'm not sure if I know of any refugees that come from such locations. But when you're thinking about what is required to be able to move forward in that kind of time span, they need access to your records and they need access to that kind of security background to be able to make sure that they can verify what it is you're sharing with them. And so you're really thinking about registration and data collection, right? You're thinking about having to kind of go through that process. You're also thinking about the security checks that they are going through. You're thinking about interviews. So for the US, that means Homeland Security interviews. And then you're thinking about the fingerprints and the biometric security checks. You're thinking about cultural orientation and medical checks that you're going through. You're thinking about being assigned to domestic resettlement agencies and locations and travel. I mean, there's multiple steps to this. And then once you get here, it's not all roses either, right? Refugees that are settled here in the US are given $1,000 to be able to survive for the first 3 months. So $1,000, I don't know about you, but when I'm thinking about rent and I'm thinking about food and I'm thinking about transportation, $1,000 doesn't go very far. rent in this area, they're not given special housing in terms of, oh, you're refugees, you get placed in these houses. No, they are on the open market, so they're competing for houses just the same as you and me. When they're thinking about jobs, they're also having to compete with you and me for those jobs, which is making it difficult for them to find jobs too, right? So when you're thinking about that $1,000 and how far it stretches, there's a lot to that process, and there's a lot to trying to make sure that that stipend is enough, right? And then after that, they're really on their own. It's not as if the government is going to just subsidize their very existence here because we're, wanting them to have a comfortable life. There's very little assistance after that point. So it becomes something where those first 3 months are critical for reestablishment, right, and making that adjustment.
Sarah, I have a question for you. How did Menotti come up with the idea to write this opera? I mean, this is a very, very sensitive and complicated issue. What inspired him to write this?
Well, rumor has it that this was written on the heels of World War II, so I'm sure there were a million stories, but the two really stood out for him, and they were very different. One was a story about a whole group of people trying to get from one country to the next and being stuck on a bridge between the two countries, and they didn't have the paperwork to either go back or to get the new one. And both countries just watched all these people starve to death on a bridge. And that was very troubling for him, obviously, as it should be to all of us. And the second story was about a family, which is why I think he wrote the protagonist the way he did. Her husband had made it out before the war. She was stuck in their home country with a small child. And when the war ended and she was begging to join him, he said, well, I've kind of met somebody new, so you can send the child, but you stay there. The child didn't want to leave his mother, so she killed herself so that the child would have to go to America and live a better life. And so rumor has it that it was those two specific tragic tales that really compelled him to craft this opera.
So when we talk about refugees, we talk about them from various points of view, depending on where we were raised, what country we grew up in, or in what part of the world we're from. Right now, I want to take a moment to pose one question to both Dr. Tim and Professor Martin. Dr. Tim spent a number of years living in Scotland in the UK, and she's also Canadian. So she offers a unique perspective in this conversation as the attitudes and just the process concerning refugees is a bit different in the UK and in Canada. After living in the US and seeing from this side of the border, what's different in the way that refugees are seen in the UK and in Canada compared to here?
That's a great comparison, I think. I'm very thankful because I have been able to live in 3 different countries, and so it's been an interesting kind of growing up experience. It's a maturation process over many years. And I think in many ways I feel like I resonate with this topic because although I have not been a refugee, I am an economic migrant. I hold 2 passports. I am both Canadian and American. And yet I never envisioned necessarily taking up my residence in the States, but I have because I was able to get a job here, and I'm very thankful for that fact. But it's meant that I'm very I have a type of privilege that other individuals don't have. In terms of the ways that that countries look at displaced persons or specifically at refugees, I think you can see evidence of that in the last few months. For example, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has been quite public about his forward-thinking way of inclusion of refugees in kind of the political and economic vision of Canada. Canada grounds itself on this idea of a multicultural heritage, and I'm not saying that it's a perfect vision by any means. It's complex. But it's seen as we have space, we have resources, come in and be part of our country. In Britain, historically, it's shifted. So historically in World War II, Britain opened its borders to children specifically, from child refugees from Europe to come over. Systems of protection were put in place for those children. More recently, though, I would say specifically in the last 3 years, the discourse around how refugees are seen has changed quite drastically. I think one of the outcomes of that is seen in Brexit, kind of the heated rhetoric that's used in terms of Britain leaving or exiting from the European Union, and that idea of becoming, some would say, more isolationist in its policies and saying, nope, this is our space. We want to govern our space. We don't want those kind of political affiliations with someone who is literally just a few miles across the channel, or the geographical space of the channel. Living in the States, I have lived here for just over 2 years now. It's also interesting to see the kind of ways that this discussion is framed. I think, for example, I was surprised to discover that it is a 2-year vetting process that is done by, I think, at least 8 or 9 different agencies, both UN and governmental federal agencies, before refugees can come into the States. And so I find it interesting that a nation based upon, you could say, founded on the idea of freedom and liberty and displaced persons who were seeking safety from religious persecution in the UK, in England at the time. Just kind of the policies put in place that have placed limitations on new people coming into the space.
So
I find it interesting.
how does the refugee crisis influence American foreign policy?
Right, it becomes an interesting question as to how we're going to respond and what are we going to do, right? And I think obviously probably what's most pressing is what have we done in the past several days, right? You know, our attacks in Syria and trying to kind of stop the reason for the flows, right? If we stop the chemical attacks, then maybe so many people won't flee Syria as maybe one thought. We can also kind of think about even the rise of far-right parties, both here in the US as well as in Europe, and that does influence, you know, how our governments are going to function, and whether or not, you know, who are we going to elect, and who are we going to have represent us, and what are our main priorities going to be from here on out, you know? What role does migration have on our government policies moving forward? And it's an interesting question, not one we necessarily have an answer to currently, right? We do see this rise, and we do see countries taking steps to try and slow this flow, right? We see it in terms of Turkey and the EU trying to put into place policies that will turn back asylum seekers. We see it in terms of Poland, in terms of routinely denying asylum seekers access to the borders. So we do see steps being taken, but it's just a matter of whether those steps will continue to be taken, what the U.S. will do moving forward in terms of Syria, what it will do in terms of other countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, Eritrea, that also produce refugees. Interesting question.
So just talking about the current events that are surrounding the refugee crisis, Sara, I'd like to ask you, how did the idea of programming this opera come about? This was a very intentional choice on the part of Opera Tennessee. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It was. I would like to say that it was a super noble effort, and it didn't occur to us until last summer when things got bad. But really, I have several singers that have been dying to sing this opera. And so we've been looking at it for probably 3 years. And this is the year to do it. People are talking about this, and now is the time to present this and maybe get more people talking and thinking about it. So it was a conscious choice to put it on. We're a little nervous too. My opera company puts on very light, fluffy, happy operas. And people like that. They like to go to the opera and be entertained and taken away in a happy way. And this, no one's gonna be skipping out of this opera. It is much darker than anything we've tackled.
So how is this opera challenging musically, both for the performers and then for the audience?
It is a modern opera. That being said, there's some really beautiful moments too. The main characters have these gorgeous things to sing, and you actually think you're in an opera. And then the rest of it, I think I spoke to it a little bit, my character is very mechanical. It literally sounds like a typewriter for 20 minutes at a time while we're in the consulate. And so musically it's challenging to learn, it's challenging to sing, and for the listener I think it's a little challenging too, not in a want to run away screaming kind of way, but you can't help but be affected by the music that he's written. The painful difference between the beautiful and heart-wrenching things that the main characters sing and these just painfully bleak moments in the consulate. I mean, you can't help but be affected in some way.
So, one question I want to touch on, and this is kind of the goal of Opportunity, is to really bring light to what's going on with this refugee crisis and how it ties to Chattanooga locally. And we're so grateful to have representatives from Mad Priest here and Bridge Refugee Services. But I want to ask Professor Martin, what does this look like when a refugee comes? Who is paying for this process? This is not free. Let's just say it that way. What are the costs associated with this?
Right. So generally, when we're thinking about resettlement, those countries that have resettlement programs, those countries are taking on the costs of those programs themselves. The UNHCR obviously operates within working toward resettling refugees and also providing support to them while they are kind of in the in between stages. Obviously also the other NGOs and other partners in the middle of this, but we also have to be thinking about the costs that the governments do take on, and we're thinking about 37 nations that now have resettlement programs. So that's quite a difference from what it used to be. I believe it used to be about 16, so it's made quite a jump.
So basically the whole concept that we've been talking about tonight is just this concept of us versus them, the concept of the other. How does this refugee crisis and just the opera and just all of this relate to this concept of the other?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's one that takes us back to kind of the core of how we envision ourselves and our sense of identity. It depends on what kind of philosophical tradition you come from or how you were raised, but often we're raised with this idea of it is myself and I am a person, I am a subject, I have agency, I can make decisions over what I want to do with my life. And ideally, we would think, oh, you are also a subject, and you are a subject, and you both have agency, and you have power over the kinds of decisions you want to make. Often what happens, though, is that we see ourselves as agents, and we see things around ourselves as kind of an object that's separate or different to ourselves. And that means that those objects are things that we can move around at will, right? That we have power over. And often I think what happens with the kind of rhetoric that is used when speaking about big numbers, right? Big numbers, millions of people halfway across the world, it becomes very easy to say, oh, well, that's happening over there, that's them, right? It's not my business, it has nothing to do with me. Oh, those poor individuals, well, if they just get their act together. And I think the recognizing that they other individuals are humans as well, recognizing their agency or their desire for agency and subjecthood, I think it allows us to perhaps escape the bounds of those numbers, of those preconceived notions of who individuals are, and instead see them as persons who have desires, who have goals, who long to be independent. And there's ways just in terms of how we reframe how we speak about individuals, rather than just using the rhetoric. Some students in the room would recognize the idea of binary opposition, right? So us versus them, we are good, you are bad, we are righteous, you are evil, whatever that term is, that distinction is, means that what if we think about it differently? What if we think about ourselves as humans, as having power, and they too have power? And how can we together empathize in our humanity and seek greater connections? How can we lift each other up? Rather than saying, I can only be lifted up if I squelch you, if I push you down. And I think it really invites us, I'm really looking forward to seeing the performance of the opera, just to say, how can I invoke this? How can I invoke change in my own attitude, in my own mental shift, and honestly in my everyday interactions with those I meet.
All right, thank you. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor for questions.
So a couple of things, one broader and then one more specific. So you guys were talking about the recent events and obviously the election and the rise of foreign politics and all this nationalist stuff. So I guess I don't know everyone's political swayings in the room, but if you're here, you're probably thinking somewhere in the middle or somewhere farther left or farther right, it doesn't matter. But with this coming about and the election results coming in and you seeing this silent majority move and this rhetoric move towards us and them and this rhetoric move towards a very borderized philosophy for being a human being and for existing. And that basically setting in for the next 4, 8, 10, 12, 20 years, however long this swing lasts until the antithesis of that comes back around. I guess, what's a game plan for someone to do? Because, right, like, we're here and we have this, but nationalism is all around us, especially in the South, especially here. And, you say, a lot of the times I hear, call your senators or do this or do that. Well, yeah, that's true, but in a far-right state, what's that going to do? I'm a drop, I'm a splash in a puddle of a very big sea, And I guess, maybe that's just rambling, but, like, my first question is, how do we combat nationalism, combat fascism, combat these things that are obviously creeping in, that we're obviously seeing, that are obviously happening, and they're happening with our neighbors and our friends and our family? How do you suppose that we go beyond that? And then my second question is, in Christianity, Adventism is set apart in a way for various reasons, semantics and otherwise, but it seems like we have the perfect chance to take hold of the situation and really make a stand for something better than what we have. And evangelicalism today in America is swinging one way and one way only, it seems. I guess my second question is, what's the game plan for, or what's a good way of life, like something practical to put into use for an Adventist and for a person who doesn't want nationalist fear-mongering a part of their everyday rhetoric and mindset?
Dr. Martin, do you want to address the first question? What are our responses? What's an appropriate response to the rhetoric that's at play right now?
I think we all, going back to agency, I think we all have the ability to impact our own bubbles and our own groups that we're around, right? And so maybe that feels like a very small splash, but I think that we have the ability through coming to things like this, through sharing ideas, through discussing what's on our minds, through constantly educating ourselves. And so many times I think that we kind of discount what reading can do for us. Reading the news, staying on top of the facts, and being able to speak to someone, and it doesn't have to be an argument, it doesn't have to be shutting someone down. It can actually just be like, actually, I've read this. You might want to you might want to go back and read this again. I might want to go back and read this again. Maybe I misunderstood, and kind of encouraging thought. So there's that in terms of kind of pushing back on these thoughts of nationalism, but also these thoughts of us versus them. I'm not necessarily saying that all patriotism is bad in all ways, right? But I think that we can create very welcoming areas, right? We can be known, and this kind of goes even into Adventism as to how we can be known as Adventists. We can be known as a welcoming population, as a group of people that are excited to mix with others, that are excited to mix with other faiths, that are not fearful of them, right? That have things to learn and things that we share in common, and that we don't need to be hesitant about that, and that it could be a really exciting thing. So I guess those are the things that I try and practice. I'm sure that there are many others to add to that list.
Yeah.
Hi. So when we normally think about refugees, we think about women and children, people fleeing from horrible situations. I have with me here the 2015 report from the German Bureau of Immigration. I'd just like to point out some numbers for you. Over 75% of asylum seekers in Germany for 2015 were male. Of those asylum seekers, 100% of them, 75% female, about average 25% female. 50% of those were below the age of 32. Then about 50% of all asylum seekers were unmarried. So this means that we have a large majority of of asylum seekers, at least in Germany being the leader of the European Union migrant crisis, the majority of these refugees coming in being single, unmarried young men. And we're seeing that leading to large social problems across the European Union. How do you recommend that, as Americans in the United States, we tailor our immigration system, our refugee acceptance system, to include more families, more family units, more able to integrate units of people within the United States instead of bringing in masses of young, unmarried. Professor Martin, would you like to?
I think that you kind of spoke to the solution there in terms of trying to integrate families versus single men. I think what you're speaking to is that the majority of these men are immigrating, are crossing these borders because their families have raised enough money for them to send one person. And when they are able to send only one person, it is safest for it to be a male, and it is safest for it to be a male that is going to be able to be of a working age, right? And so that absolutely does create implications further down the line. You spoke to them, absolutely. And I think that the best case scenario is when there is a functioning family that is able to hold each other accountable, that is able to create the family structure that will provide comfort, that will reduce anxiety from this transition that we know is going to be very, very difficult, right? So I think that you spoke to a great solution there in terms of trying to indeed immigrate the whole family and resettle the whole family versus it being on an ad hoc basis or a solo expedition. I think that would be the best case scenario. Oftentimes, though, when families are fleeing, they are separated. So that isn't always an option, right? And that is just a necessary part of the process that we have to face.
We have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I also think it gives us an opportunity to reframe what are positive things that people can bring to society.
Yeah.
So what an opportunity for a single individual who perhaps doesn't have those kinds of financial or family burdens or commitments that can be perhaps moved to spaces that wouldn't be appropriate for a family to live within. Because if you have a family, you need to have the infrastructure for education, providing services for the entire, healthcare for the whole family. Whereas for an individual single person, perhaps they could go to other places as well.
We had a question right over here.
Hi everyone. I have a question for First, thank you so much for the meeting to support the refugee for all the world that came into America. I have a question. So anybody meet refugee people here around this area in Chattanooga?
So, have you anyone met a refugee?
Because I'm the refugee here. I came to America in 2009. And I have to thank you so much for the meeting. And we have a lot of family here. They need support and they need help. And they are very welcome to help them. Some like when I came here, they helped me a lot. They support my children. My son was 8 months when we came to America. Now he has 8 years old. He sounds like American. I'm a citizen right now also. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious. I feel like another thing that we need to bring into discussion is oftentimes refugees are very vulnerable. And they are vulnerable to human trafficking and being exploited and being put into like forced labor. So I was just curious how the opera as well as literature plays on those motifs.
It doesn't get quite that desperate for the characters in this opera. It's desperate in many, many other ways. But some of the characters you meet are struggling with things that are almost desperate enough that they'll do anything. There's the woman who did just get out of a concentration camp. What is she going to do? Would she be one of those vulnerable people? Probably. Her husband's missing and she has no place to go and she has nothing. That is somebody who's going to do anything she needs to get out of that country. And the main character too. I mean, her baby is starving to death at home and her mother is starving to death at home and her husband is somewhere. That's desperation. I think it brings desperation to light, but gratefully, I think for my opera audience, it doesn't actually show what lengths they go to.
I think literature often mimics or extends those kinds of debates and discussions. I think often it comes down to a representation of desperation, right? There is something about the desperation, desperate desire to survive, right? And I think it's amazing to me how individuals will starve for days or be under horrendous conditions and survive, right? What an amazing thing, the resiliency of human character. But I think despite that, people may be desperate, trying to survive, but also that isolation, and I think not only physical isolation, but emotional and psychological, that isolation that can result from that, thinking that I am alone, especially if no one cares for me, right? That's often brought up in fiction or in poetry. And so I think in some respects it comes down to just simply providing the basic fundamental physical needs that we require as humans. Providing food, providing a safe space to live, providing adequate clothing, and those kinds of things that we can offer so that it doesn't become such a desperate or isolating situation.
So I'm wondering if there's any multinational initiatives to help these countries that are obviously under tremendous pressure because they're taking in such a huge number of refugees, maybe a little reluctantly, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so who's helping Turkey? Who's helping these countries?
These are good questions. I can't answer with specifics in terms of initiatives, but there are always debates as to, whether or not we should allow refugees to actually work with the skills that they have, right? And I think that this brings up a powerful question. Many of these refugees come with jobs, right? They have professions, they have certification, whether they be doctors, teachers, lawyers, whatever it is they are, and refugees need all of these services, but we don't allow refugees to work, right? And so it kind of begs the question of what could refugees be doing for each other, and what sorts of initiatives could these refugees be kind of undertaking for themselves to kind of create that agency, and what could we as countries that are involved in this process, what could we be doing to enable that agency to move forward? And so I think that these are good questions to be asking.
All right, we have time for one more question before we hear from Bridge. Do you have another question? Yes.
Professor Martin, you mentioned that there was $1,000 given to a refugee. Is that $1,000 per person, per household, or per family, or is that $1,000 to head of household?
It's a really good question. I would have to look at my exact statistics. She can answer it. Bridge, thank you.
We'll just turn it over right now.
Yes, thank you.
Bridge.
Yes.
So it's $925 per individual. So if it's a family coming with 2 or 3 children, that's $925 per person, which makes it a little easier for bigger families as opposed to individuals. Hi guys, my name is Valerie Brite, and I'm the volunteer manager at Bridge Refugee Services. Thank you so much for coming out to this. I think that first and foremost, the best thing that we can do is to just, like you said, educate people to learn the facts and to point out where people are spreading facts that may not be true and correct those thoughts and such. So this is great. As far as what you guys can actually do to get involved, 2 things. So with Bridge, you can always volunteer directly with us. We're always in need of people to help in the office, to help get to people to appointments. In the first 30 days that refugees are here, they have probably 25 appointments that they have to get to. So getting people there is a big thing if you have free time. If you ever need volunteer hours for a class, or you're interested in interning with Bridge, we take a lot of social work interns. We've had international studies interns. And so we would love to host you as an intern. Please talk to me, talk with my director. And if you want firsthand knowledge on what that experience is like, talk to our friend Carlita here, who's a social work student interning with Bridge. And then I would also like to briefly talk about, there's a group called UMFA, Adventist Muslim Friendship Association. And there are representatives from this group here tonight. They have a lot of programs going on that are already working with Southern students. I know that they have an after-school program assisting families who need help or who have kids that need help with homework and such, and other ongoing volunteer opportunities. So I would direct you to them, and as I said, over there
They can tell you they can tell you all about that. If I have information here, brochures that have all of Bridge's contact information on it, I would encourage you to like our Facebook page to keep up with things we have going on. This June, if you're still around town, we'll have a big World Refugee Day celebration, which would be great to have you all there. So just, yeah, keep up with us. And if you have specific questions or you want to know more, come talk to me. And then my coworker, Jennifer Consul, who's our pre-arrival and school specialist, we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have about specifics of resettlement here in Chattanooga.
All right, thank you so much,
guys.
Valerie. That concludes our convocation tonight. If you do need the convocation credit, make sure you put your name and your ID number on the yellow sheets over there. And then any of the individuals that spoke tonight will be available for a little bit to talk, to answer questions. So feel free to mingle a little bit and ask whatever you'd like. Thank you.